He had always been the kind of man who preferred quiet over noise. After years of working long hours, saving every penny, and dealing with the chaos of city life, he finally moved into a calm suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place with clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and friendly smiles that sometimes felt a little too practiced. Still, he thought it was perfect. The house he bought wasn't huge, but it had everything he wanted: a small garden, a backyard where he could sit with his morning coffee, and tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. But there was one thing missing: privacy. The houses stood close to each other, and he could almost hear every word his neighbors said from their patios. So after a few weeks of living there, he decided to build a simple wooden fence around his backyard. It wasn't flashy or expensive, just tall enough to give him some space. He wanted to enjoy his evenings without worrying about being watched or interrupted. He even made sure the fence followed the city's height rules. Everything was done properly, step by step. When the fence was finished, he felt proud. It gave his backyard a cozy look, and for the first time he felt that peace he had dreamed of. But that peace didn't last long. A few days later, he noticed two of his neighbors standing near the sidewalk, pointing at his fence and whispering. At first, he ignored it. People talk and that's normal. But then a white envelope appeared in his mailbox. It had the bold letters HOA written on the corner. Inside was a notice that said his fence was too tall and not compliant with community standards. It also stated that he needed to remove or lower it within 2 weeks and or face daily fines. He read the letter twice, thinking it must be a mistake. The fence wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't blocking sunlight or crossing property lines. Still, he decided to reach out to the homeowners association to clear things up. When he called, the woman who answered sounded polite but cold. She said, "Rules are rules. You can't have a fence higher than 4 feet. It ruins the uniform look of the neighborhood." He tried to explain that the city had approved it and that he just wanted privacy, but she didn't seem to care. Her tone was final. "You'll have to take it down," she said, "or you'll start getting fined." That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch looking at the fence he had built with his own hands. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol of peace, something he had earned after years of hard work. And now someone wanted to take it away over a rule that didn't even make sense. The next morning, he decided to attend the HOA's monthly meeting. He wanted to talk to them face to face and explain things calmly. When he arrived at the community center, there were about a dozen people sitting around a table. Most of them looked like they had already made up their minds before he even opened his mouth. He introduced himself, thanked them for their time, and explained everything clearly: how he had checked the regulations, how his fence didn't harm anyone, and how it made him feel more comfortable in his own home. He hoped they would understand, but after he finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment, until one of the board members chuckled and said, "We can't start making exceptions for everyone who wants to break the rules. If we let you keep your fence, next thing you know, people will start painting their houses purple." Everyone laughed except him. He felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He realized they weren't listening to understand. They were listening to respond, to show authority. One of them leaned forward and said, "You'll start getting fined next week if it's not lowered." "That's final." He left the meeting quietly. As he walked back home, he noticed a few neighbors watching from their driveways. He could feel their judgment, that silent kind of gossip that spreads faster than truth. Within a week, the fines started coming. First $50, then $100. Letters kept arriving, each one colder than the last. But instead of tearing down the fence, he started researching. He stayed up late reading HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and property codes. The more he read, the more he noticed something strange. The HOA's own documents were inconsistent. Some of their rules hadn't been updated in years. They were citing sections that didn't even exist anymore. He even found that his fence's height actually met the original neighborhood design plan from when the community was built. The rule they were quoting had been changed later, without a proper vote from members, which was required by law. This wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about control. Still, he didn't want to fight with anger. He decided to handle it calmly, step by step. He started documenting everything, every letter, every email, every fine notice. He took photos of other houses in the area with fences even taller than his, none of which had been targeted. Then he began to notice something else. The same board members who were fining him were also approving changes for their friends. Larger sheds, Taller hedges, different paint colors. They were breaking the same rules they were enforcing. That realization changed everything. One evening, while watering his plants, he saw one of his neighbors walking by. She stopped, glanced at his fence, and whispered, "They did the same thing to us last year. We gave up and tore ours down. It's easier to stay quiet." He smiled kindly but didn't say much. Deep down, he knew staying quiet wasn't the answer. That night, he sat in his backyard under the dim light of his porch, thinking. He could hear crickets, the distant hum of traffic, and the wind brushing against the fence. He ran his hand along the wood, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. He had two choices: give up like everyone else or stand his ground. He took a deep breath and decided. He wasn't going to let a handful of people bully him into giving up what was rightfully his. He wasn't just protecting a fence. He was protecting his peace, his home, and his right to live without unnecessary control. He didn't know it yet, but this small act of defiance would lead to something far bigger than anyone could imagine. Something that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. Because soon, the man with the too-tall fence would become the man who owned the HOA building. He woke up early the next morning to the sound of the mail truck stopping outside. Another letter had arrived, another fine. He picked it up, didn't even bother opening it this time, and placed it on the growing pile on his kitchen counter. There were already more than a dozen. It felt like every envelope carried the same cold message. You're wrong. We control this place. But instead of letting frustration take over, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. He stared at the fence that had caused so much trouble. It stood quietly in the morning light, sturdy and peaceful, just like he wanted his life to be. He wasn't ready to let anyone take that away. He decided to go back to the HOA meeting the following week. Not to argue, but to observe. This time he sat in the back, quietly listening. The same board members were there, talking about landscaping fees, garbage rules, and mailbox colors. They sounded proud, like they were running a kingdom instead of a neighborhood. Then came the part about fines and violations. His name was mentioned again, followed by a few snide comments about troublemakers. He felt his jaw tighten, but he stayed calm. He wanted to see how they operated, how decisions were made. And what he saw told him everything he needed to know. There were no real votes, no fairness, no discussion. The president of the HOA simply made decisions and the rest nodded in agreement. They acted like their word was law. When the meeting ended, a few residents came up to him quietly. One of them whispered, "Don't take it personally. They do this to everyone sooner or later." Another added, "I stopped going to meetings years ago. It's pointless." He thanked them and went home, but something about those words stuck with him. Everyone had accepted the unfairness as normal. People were tired, scared of fines, and afraid of being targeted. That night, he pulled out the stack of letters again. He noticed something strange. The fine amounts weren't consistent. Some were $75, some $100, others $150. He checked the HOA's own bylaw documents online and realized the board was charging random amounts without any legal backing. The deeper he looked, the more he found. The HOA hadn't held proper elections for nearly 3 years, which was a direct violation of their own rules. There were no financial reports available to the residents. Nobody knew where their monthly fees were actually going. He started making notes, page after page, filling a folder with evidence. He wasn't doing it out of anger anymore. He was doing it out of principle. He wanted to know the truth. Over the next few weeks, he began talking to more neighbors. At first, people were hesitant to open up, but once they realized he wasn't just complaining, they started sharing stories. One family had been fined for painting their door a slightly different shade of blue. Another man was told to remove his bird feeder because it attracted wildlife. One older couple said they had stopped planting flowers because the HOA didn't approve their color coordination. It was the same: pattern, unfair treatment, small power trips, and silence from those who couldn't fight back. He told them what he had found about the missing elections and financial irregularities. Their eyes widened. Most of them had no idea they were allowed to see the HOA's financial records. The more they talked, the more people started to realize that the board had been running unchecked for years. Together, they decided to do something small but powerful. They filed a written request asking for the HOA's latest financial report, meeting minutes, and proof of elections. They signed it as a group with over a dozen signatures, A week later, the HOA sent a short, dismissive reply. Your request is unnecessary. All records are in order, but that answer wasn't just disrespectful, it was illegal. Homeowners had the right to access that information, so he took the next step. He reached out to the county's property office and asked for help understanding HOA transparency laws. The officer he spoke with confirmed that the board was breaking several legal requirements. Armed with that knowledge, he sent a formal complaint to the local compliance department. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was about fairness. If the HOA wanted to enforce rules, they should follow them too. Weeks passed. The HOA members didn't know what was coming. They kept sending him fines, but now he didn't react. He kept calm, quiet, and focused. One evening as he was mowing his lawn, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. It was the HOA president and another board member. They stepped out, pretending to smile. "We'd like to talk," she said. He turned off the mower, wiped his hands, and nodded politely. They said they'd received notice from the county asking for their records and financial documents. They wanted to know if he had anything to do with it. He didn't lie. He looked at them and said, "Yes, I filed it." "Every homeowner deserves transparency." The woman's smile faded. "You could have just worked this out with us," she said coldly. He replied calmly, "I tried. You didn't listen." They left without another word. That night, for the first time in months, he felt a small sense of peace. He didn't know what would happen next, but at least he was standing for something right. Days later, a notice went out to the entire neighborhood announcing an emergency HOA audit. It turned out the board had failed to keep several years' worth of proper records. Some funds were unaccounted for. People started asking questions, and the board's confident tone began to crack. At the same time, he discovered something curious while researching. The HOA building itself wasn't owned by the association. It was a small office space rented from a private owner, and recently it had been listed for sale. He didn't think much of it at first, but that thought stayed in his mind like a spark waiting to ignite. He checked the listing details again that night. The building wasn't expensive, not compared to what some people spent on landscaping or home upgrades. He had savings. It wasn't impossible. That's when an idea began to form in his mind, a quiet, brilliant idea that would change everything. He didn't tell anyone right away. He just closed his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and smiled to himself. The HOA thought they had all the power. But soon they would learn that sometimes the quietest man in the room can make the loudest move of all. The days passed quietly after the audit notice went out. The neighborhood felt different now. People who used to avoid eye contact were suddenly friendly. Some would stop by to ask how the investigation was going. Others slipped short notes of thanks into his mailbox, saying things like, "You did what we were all too scared to do." But he didn't see himself as a hero. He was just tired of being pushed around. Still, it felt good knowing that people were beginning to realize they had rights too. Meanwhile, the HOA board was growing nervous. Their cheerful newsletters stopped arriving. The usual patrols around the neighborhood, where board members used to inspect lawns and driveways, came to an end. The president no longer waved at anyone. Everything seemed quieter. Too quiet. One evening, while watering his plants, he saw two men standing in front of the HOA office building. They were talking to a real estate agent. His curiosity grew, so the next morning he checked the property listings again. Sure enough, the building was still up for sale, and at a surprisingly low price. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the screen. The idea from before returned, stronger this time. What if he actually bought it? He ran the numbers over and over again. It wasn't impossible. Between his savings, some investments, and a small loan, it could work. The thought made him smile. The irony of it all. The same people who had tried to bully him might soon be renting their own meeting room from him. He didn't tell anyone, not even the neighbors who had supported him. He wanted to move quietly. Over the next few weeks, he focused on the paperwork. The property owner turned out to be an older gentleman who had been renting the space to the HOA for years. When he learned that the buyer was a local resident, he was pleased. "They're not the easiest tenants," the man said with a laugh. "If you want it, I'll make the process smooth." It took some time, but eventually everything was signed. The building was his. He didn't feel like celebrating. Instead, he just drove to the small office one evening, parked outside, and sat there in silence. The lights inside were off. The windows reflected the soft glow of the streetlights. He thought about all the meetings that had happened inside, the scolding voices, the threats, the unfair decisions. And now he owned the place where all of it began. He leaned back and smiled to himself. It felt like life had finally come full circle. The following week, the HOA held their regular meeting in the same building, not knowing anything had changed. He decided to attend. When he walked in, people looked surprised to see him. Some gave him cold looks, others whispered quietly. The president started the meeting in her usual commanding tone, going over agenda points as if nothing had happened. He waited patiently, saying nothing until the end. When the meeting was almost over, he raised his hand. The room went silent. The president frowned but said, "Fine, you have 2 minutes." He stood up slowly and spoke in a calm voice. "I just wanted to let everyone know there's been a small change regarding this property. As of last week, I'm the new owner of this building." The room froze. You could hear the sound of someone's pen drop. At first, no one spoke. The president blinked, clearly thinking he was joking. "Excuse me?" she said. He repeated it. "I bought this building. The previous owner decided to sell, and the paperwork is complete. I'm your new landlord." A few people gasped quietly. Others looked down, hiding their smiles. He continued, still calm. "Your lease was about to expire next month. I'll be renewing it, but there will be some changes. Updated terms, maintenance improvements, and yes, a rent adjustment." The president's face turned red. "You can't just," she began, but he gently interrupted. "Everything has been done legally. You'll receive the documents by the end of the week." Then he thanked them for their time and left the room as quietly as he'd entered. Outside, he took a deep breath of the cool evening air. He didn't feel angry or proud, just peaceful. He had fought his battle not with shouting, but with patience and logic. The following days were filled with whispers and shocked faces. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. The same man who had been fined and humiliated for his fence was now the owner of the HOA's building. Soon, the board received his new lease proposal. It was fair but firm. The rent had increased slightly and all future payments had to be made on time. He wasn't being cruel. He just wanted them to experience accountability for once. When the HOA realized they didn't have enough funds to cover the new rent, panic set in. They had mismanaged the money for so long that the account was nearly empty. The audit reports confirmed it. They couldn't even afford to move to another office space. Within weeks, the board began to fall apart. One member resigned, then another. The president tried to rally support, but no one backed her anymore. People were tired of her attitude, tired of the unfairness. Meanwhile, the man stayed calm. He didn't argue, didn't mock, didn't boast. He just went about his life as usual, mowing his lawn, watering his garden, and waving politely to anyone who passed by. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now came over to talk. Some even invited him to dinner, thanking him for standing up for everyone. They told him they felt freer now, less afraid of being punished for small things. It was strange how one fence had started all of this, a simple fence meant for peace. Yet that fence had exposed a system built on control and pride. A few weeks later, an announcement was sent out to the neighborhood. The HOA board had officially stepped down. Temporary members would be appointed until a fair election could be held. For the first time in years, the residents would actually get to vote. The man received a note slipped under his door that night. It had no name, just a few words written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for showing us that power doesn't always win." "Sometimes patience does," he smiled as he read it. He didn't keep the note for long, just folded it and placed it inside his journal. He wasn't planning on running for the new board. That wasn't what this was about. All he wanted was fairness, respect, and the right to enjoy his home in peace. Still, he couldn't help but laugh sometimes at how everything had turned out. They said his fence was too tall. But in the end, it wasn't the fence that stood too high, it was their pride. And that was the thing that finally came crashing down. After the HOA board resigned, the neighborhood entered a strange period of calm. For the first time in a long while, there were no warning letters, no fines, and no judgmental glances from people pretending to protect community standards. It almost felt like the man didn't go to the next few meetings. He didn't need to. The temporary committee was made up of ordinary residents, people who actually cared about their neighbors, not just about rules. They wanted to rebuild the association from the ground up, fairly this time. One afternoon he sat on his porch sipping his coffee when one of the new committee members walked over. She thanked him for what he'd done and said, "You made us realize we were letting fear run this place." He smiled and shook his head. "All I did was buy a building," he said quietly. "The rest was just common sense." But deep down he knew it wasn't just about buying the building. It was about showing that people didn't have to bow down to unfair systems. Sometimes standing quietly for what's right makes the biggest difference. The old HOA president moved out of the neighborhood not long after. No one knew exactly where she went, but the change she left behind was permanent. For the first time, people started talking openly about decisions. Small disagreements didn't turn into threats or fines. Neighbors were learning to trust each other again. Still, he stayed cautious. He didn't want the same problems to rise again. So he started using the HOA building, the one he now owned, as a place for real community work. He opened it for free on weekends so neighbors could hold small events, like garage sales, children's art shows, and local charity drives. What was once a symbol of fear now became a place of laughter and connection. Kids played outside, people brought food to share, and everyone finally started to feel like they belonged. One Saturday, he stood quietly at the back of the building, watching families gather for a bake sale. He saw kids running around, someone strumming a guitar, and a group of elderly neighbors laughing over cups of lemonade. For a moment, he thought back to the first time he had come to this same building. Nervous, frustrated, standing in front of people who had treated him like an outsider. Now it was different. He had turned that same space into something better. Still, not everyone was ready to let go of the past. A few of the old HOA members tried to form their own group again, claiming they could restore order. They sent out letters saying the new committee was too relaxed. But this time no one listened. People had seen what real community looked like, and they weren't willing to go back. When those letters arrived in his mailbox, he didn't even bother opening them. He knew how that story ended. Weeks turned into months, and things slowly settled into balance. The neighborhood became known for its friendly atmosphere. New families started moving in, drawn by the calmness and unity. Sometimes he would walk his dog in the evening, passing by homes that used to have tension and silence. Now he'd hear the sounds of barbecues, music, and laughter. People waved at him, thanked him, and shared stories about how much better life felt. He always gave the same simple answer: "I just wanted to enjoy my fence in peace." One day, a small local newspaper caught wind of the story. A reporter reached out, curious about the man who had bought the HOA building. He agreed to meet, but made one thing clear: he didn't want fame or attention. He just wanted to share what he had learned. During the interview, the reporter asked, "What made you go that far? Most people would have just taken the fence down." He thought for a moment and said, "Because it wasn't just a fence anymore. It was about fairness. I didn't build it to challenge anyone. I built it because I wanted privacy, peace, and a little space for myself. But when someone tries to take away your peace for no reason, you have to decide whether you'll stay quiet or stand up for yourself. I chose to stand." The article came out a week later. The headline read, "The man who bought his HOA building to win back his peace." The story spread quickly online. People loved it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. It reminded everyone that standing up for yourself doesn't always have to be loud or angry. Sometimes it just means refusing to be pushed around no matter how small the issue seems. A few weeks later, the county office even reached out to him. They wanted to use his story as an example in a community workshop about homeowner rights and HOA accountability. He didn't expect that, but he agreed. If his experience could help others avoid the same problems, it was worth it. The workshop turned out to be packed. People came from nearby towns, sharing their own stories about unfair treatment from HOAs. Some had been fined for silly reasons: wrong grass height, small garden decorations, paint colors that weren't neutral enough. He listened, gave advice where he could, and encouraged everyone to stay calm and use knowledge instead of anger. By the end of the session, one woman came up to him and said, "I didn't think there were good people left in this world. You proved me wrong." He smiled gently. "I think there are good people everywhere," he said. "They just need a reason to act." Back home that evening, he sat on his porch again. The sun was setting behind his fence, painting the sky orange and gold. The same fence that had once caused him endless trouble now stood as a reminder of patience and quiet strength. Sometimes he laughed when he thought about it. All that noise, all that drama over a fence. Yet if none of that had happened, maybe the neighborhood would still be living under fear and silence. He took a slow breath and looked around. The lawns were green, the air was calm, and somewhere nearby someone was playing soft music. It was everything he had wanted when he first moved there: peace, freedom, and a sense of belonging. He didn't know what the future would bring. But one thing was certain: the days of unfair rules and hidden control were gone for good. As he finished his coffee and stood up to go inside, he glanced at the wooden boards of his fence, the ones he had built with his own hands. He smiled to himself and whispered, "It was worth it." And in that quiet evening light, it really was. Months had passed since everything had settled down. The neighborhood looked peaceful again. Not perfect, but real. You could hear laughter from backyards, see children riding their bikes, and smell barbecue smoke on weekends. It finally felt like a place people wanted to live in, not just a place they were stuck with. The man's fence still stood exactly as it had on the day he built it. The same height, the same wood, the same quiet strength. Every now and then, he would walk around it, checking if it needed a new coat of paint or a small repair. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about what it stood for. It had become a reminder of everything he had learned through those long months of frustration, patience, and quiet victory. One Sunday morning, he was trimming the bushes when a young couple stopped by. They had just moved into the neighborhood and introduced themselves with wide smiles. The man welcomed them warmly and gave them a few small tips about local stores and parks. Before leaving, the husband said, "We heard about what you did. You're kind of a legend around here." He laughed softly and said, "Legend? No, just a man who didn't want to cut his fence." They all laughed together, but deep inside he knew the story had grown far beyond just the fence. It had become a lesson for everyone who lived there. A reminder that sometimes standing your ground can change more than just one life. The new HOA committee had completely transformed the way things worked. Instead of letters filled with threats, residents now received updates about community events, local fundraisers, and helpful tips. The board even started hosting monthly gatherings where people could share ideas and concerns openly. It felt like a community again, something that hadn't existed there for years. One afternoon, the committee invited him to speak at one of their meetings. He wasn't sure what to say at first, but he agreed. When he stood at the front of the room, he looked at all the familiar faces. The same people who once avoided him, now smiling and nodding. He spoke simply. "I never wanted to fight anyone," he began. "I just wanted to live in peace like all of you. But peace doesn't mean staying quiet when something's wrong. Sometimes you have to speak up calmly, respectfully, and firmly. And when you do it the right way, you'll be surprised how much changes." The room fell silent for a moment, and then everyone clapped. It wasn't a loud or dramatic applause, just warm, honest appreciation. After the meeting, several people came up to thank him, not for what he had done, but for the example he had set. As time went on, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local news channels shared it again, calling it a modern tale of patience and justice. People from other cities sent letters to the HOA office, asking how they could make their own communities more fair and open. Some even came to visit just to see the famous fence that changed everything. He didn't like the attention, but he appreciated what it represented: hope. One evening, he was sitting in his backyard, watching the sunset. The sky was a soft shade of orange and pink, and the air was still. He could hear faint laughter from a nearby house. Everything felt calm. As he sat there, he thought back to the very beginning, that first letter from the HOA, the meetings, the endless nights of worry. It all seemed like a different lifetime now. But he realized something important. Sometimes the toughest challenges don't just test you, they also shape you. Before all of this, he had been quiet, maybe too quiet. He had always believed it was easier to avoid conflict than to face it. But through this experience, he learned that silence isn't always peace. Real peace comes from standing up when you need to, even if your voice. A few days later, the new HOA president came to visit him. She was young, polite, and full of ideas for improving the neighborhood. She thanked him again for everything he'd done and asked if he'd consider helping out as an advisor for the community. He smiled and shook his head. "I think you're all doing fine without me," he said. "It's your turn now." She laughed and agreed. "Still, you're always welcome at our meetings, especially in your own building." He laughed too. "That's true. I suppose I'll always have a seat there." When she left, he looked toward the small office building across the street. The windows were lit from the inside, and he could see people moving around. Neighbors, friends, ordinary folks working together instead of against each other. That little building had once been a place he dreaded stepping into. Now it was filled with light, laughter, and fairness. It was strange how life worked sometimes. The same place that caused him so much stress had become the heart of something good. Later that night, as he was closing his garden gate, he noticed an older neighbor standing nearby. The man smiled and said, "You know, I used to think your fence was too tall too, but now I think it's just right." He chuckled and replied, "It was never about the height. It was about what stood behind it." They both laughed quietly before parting ways. When he went back inside, he sat by the window and looked out one last time before turning off the lights. The moonlight fell softly on the fence, and for a brief second, he thought about how far everything had come. Not just for him, but for everyone around him. He knew people would eventually forget the details. Maybe someday new families would move in and not even know the story, and that was fine. What mattered was the change that had already happened. The new sense of fairness, the stronger bond between neighbors, and the quiet reminder that one person's patience could inspire many. Before going to bed, he wrote a short line in his notebook, something he'd started doing during the hardest days of the fight. This time he wrote, "Peace is not built by avoiding storms, but by standing through them calmly." He closed the notebook and placed it on the table. Then, with a faint smile, he turned off the lamp and went to sleep, knowing that he had finally found what he was looking for all along: peace, both around him and within him, and in that peaceful neighborhood. Behind that simple wooden fence, life moved forward, quietly, kindly, and with a little more understanding than before.